Today we have on our panel Mr. Michael Helu, and prior to taking up, he is the Director of Technical Center for Agricultural and Rural Cooperation, ACPEU National. And prior to taking up his post at CTA on May 2010, Mr. Helu was Director of Communications and a member of the senior leadership team of the World Agroforestry Center in Nairobi, Kenya. He has also served as Secretary of the Governing Board between 2009 and 2007. Mr. Helu was Director of Information at the Center of International Forestry Research in Indonesia. He played a key role in organizing the first Forest Day event during the 2007 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bali. Similarly, he has led organization of the Second World Congress of Agroforestry in Nairobi in 2009. Mr. Helu holds a degree in Information Sciences and Economics at the University of Pittsburgh, USA, Ethiopia, respectively as well. He has also received training in strategic leadership at Stanford University Graduate School of Business in the USA. We also have Mr. John King, who is the project coordinator, Inter-American Institute Corporation on Agriculture, ICA in Suriname. Mr. King is currently the ICA project coordinator in Suriname, where he worked. Portfolio has included collaboration with Red Cross on disaster preparedness amongst rural and indigenous farming groups. In addition, he has worked extensively in rice farming, breeding and commercial production system, and as part of rice improvement networks. We have also Mr. Greg Rawlins, and he's the country representative, Inter-American Institute Corporation on Agriculture, ICA in Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Rawlins, as you know, is no stranger to the region, and he currently serves as the country representative, as I said before, in the Trinidad ICA office, with specialization in economic analysis, policy formulation, external trade and economic negotiations, project management and planning. Mr. Rawlins brings a wealth of expertise to the Forum for Agriculture and Rural Development in the multifaceted scope. We also have on the panel Rafina Paul, and Ms. Rafina Paul Moore is a national of St. Lucia, was trained at the University of West Indies, and she possesses a Master's of Arts and Rural Planning and Development from the University Guelph in Canada. Mrs. Paul has more than a quarter century of working experience in all aspects of agricultural development, and since 2004 she's a member of the board of directors of the Wilmwood Island Farmers Association. Previously she worked at the Ministry of Agriculture, Lands, Fisheries, Forestry and Cooperatives of St. Lucia, administering the establishment of the institutional capacity oriented to the provision of appropriate data sets to guide the process of agricultural planning, formulation, and implementation. For the last 10 years, Mrs. Paul has been engaged in assignments with FAO, UNDP, OECS, UNIFEM, ICA, CARAPN, EU, Landell Mill Development Consultants, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Socio Investment Fund, Oxfam, and WINFA. Thank you.
In terms of policy and my experience, Caribbean agriculture, I think my 50 years role, of my 50 years experience has taught me that we know what to do. We know what needs to be done, generally speaking. I recall in the 1990s, listening to a policy statement on cassette at the time. And if I was not aware, I would have figured it was a minister speaking in the 1980s when I just joined the ministry. The concepts were the same, the land issues were the same, the question of what to do, how to do it, we all know. For some reason, we seem not to be able to move from the point of knowing what to do to actualizing it. And here we are, all of us almost near to retirement, and we still say the same thing. And it begs a question for me that probably we need to look at ourselves as the middle persons in the sector. It seems to me that agriculture is a policy level where we know what to do. There are the farmers who also know what to do, but they know when not to know what to do, if you understand what I'm saying. And we, the technocrats in the middle, maybe we need to reflect on ourselves in terms of our capacity to really actualize policy, taking it from the word to the action.
In the area of policy, we have not been able to give effect to policies that will bring about the kind of response that we need to bring about at the level of the farm enterprise, or the level of people involved who can invest in agriculture. The fundamental problem is that I believe that if we create an environment that it makes it attractive, that people can make money, that people will increase production, they will respond. But very often we design the policy statements, we make the statements, but we don't back up the statements with the resources that will allow people to be able to make the money that they need to make. So that for years we have had policy, we've had stated policy, but often we haven't seen the response. And I gather that it relates to, is a reality that we face in terms of the level of competitiveness of the countries in the region, our ability to compete in certain areas. If we say that agriculture is important, if we say that food security is important, and we want to increase food production, the reality is that for many of the smaller countries in the region, there's going to be a significant cost. And therefore we need to accept, if we don't have the resources to put into the sector, then what type of, we have to develop a policy that is consistent with the resources we have. And maybe the very ambitious statements we make very often and the targets that we set, it will not appear that we are falling that short, because very often we set over-ambitious targets that we can't achieve, and therefore we end up falling short and then saying that the sector is not performing. So I'm saying we have to start by analyzing very clearly what we are doing, where we are going, the areas we are going to focus on, and establish if in fact we want to produce these items for these various markets, then we need to put in some resources. And that in itself is an issue that we need to address.
Looking at this policy issue, if we're looking at the value chain, right, that is giving you a perspective, because there you have all the players that are involved in a commodity. We're talking about food security. When we're talking about food security, it is not only food security within a nation, on national level, but also global. Why I'm saying this? Because in the past few years, when you had the economic crisis, the countries in the Middle East are investing in other countries, looking for land, and they are investing to secure their food. So we have to look within our own national policy, how we're going to cope with this. But on the other hand, what we see that the analysis of our own subsector is very weak, and that's why we are trying to, or on the other hand, what we need to do is to try to analyze and focus on a few subsectors that are spearheading the activity within agriculture. Of course, it is important that we look at the different technology, because agriculture should be market-driven. It should be focusing on not only the global environment, but also the regional and the national environment. And most of the time, the national environment is giving us a lot of problems.
From the discussions, basically the topic I want to talk about is linking research to policy and the role of communications in that whole process, and how important that is. And I think from the discussions during the climate change workshops that we had, and just this morning from the remarks that Mr. Rawlings made, you can clearly see that there is a need for research, and research to be very much linked with policy making process. But it doesn't usually happen, especially from my experience in Africa and also where I worked in Indonesia. There is a total gap between the whole research process and how it gets into policy making. If I may, could I ask how many people here are predominantly engaged in research and academia? Can you raise your hand? People working in research, academia? Okay. Those working in policy area, policy support, policy making? Okay. Those coming from the civil society, farmers groups or any other civil society? All right, media? Okay, so we have a fairly good representation, I think, in this room. So to me, the challenges and the weak link between research and policy, basically there is a very poor understanding among researchers about the policy needs, the policy requirements, and usually researchers are, I think, quite notorious for just focusing on their schedule, on going through the details and not necessarily diverging data to meet policy needs. So it's usually out of sync. You could have a long-term research that you're engaged in, and the researchers would be dying to get information because there is a food crisis, there is some pest outbreak, and they have to make some decisions. But the researchers are not forthcoming. So researchers usually don't really understand, or they don't respond to the policy needs. And on the policy side, most policymakers have very little appreciation for the value of research. So they will be very much influenced by what the media says, what the NGOs are pushing for, not necessarily looking at the data. So there is a big gap between the two. On the other hand, I think researchers have a great opportunity to be proactively engaged in policy making, especially in agriculture now. There is a huge recognition about the importance of agriculture in the whole issue of food security, economic growth, and the whole issue of mitigation and adaptation to climate change that we discussed. So there is a policy space, I think, for research to contribute. And also, I think in many countries within the ACP, there are existing processes and opportunities that research can contribute. At the same time, regional and global opportunities also exist. If you look at, for example, what's going on in climate change, people are looking for data and scientific input on how agriculture can contribute to some of these policy discussions. So for research, I think the strategy should be to get the right information at the right time, in the right format, and to be really responsive to the policy needs. And usually, I think we shouldn't, just wait for research outcomes to be finalized to contribute to policy, but the researcher should be much more proactively engaged in also helping to set the agenda, because there are a lot of issues that policymakers are not even aware of, that the scientists and the research communities is quite conversant with. So the research should be much more proactive and put issues on the agenda for discussions. But there are lots of myths going around. For example, in Africa, the whole issue of GMO food is a big thing. Every day you see all sorts of allegations coming from the papers. But there is no solid research or any scientist coming up and giving their views. So in terms of putting records straight, what works, what doesn't work, supported by research data, the scientists and the research community should be much more proactive to put these issues on the table and advise on policy. And the whole area of creating partnerships, with different stakeholders, the farmers groups, NGOs, policymakers, the youth and all that. How do we engage all the different voices in the whole policy process? And I think, as Fonseca said earlier, what would be the role of the media in all this? Because media has access to the public trusts the media, but most of the time the media is not well informed. They don't have the data, the researchers are not again forthcoming to advise and inform media in terms of the issues. So I think it really requires the engagement of all the sectors and proactively being engaged in the policy process, in the communication process, and getting everyone on board on those issues.